Exciting news, the Planet Peterson store on Shopify is now open. Click the top link in the description to go to Shopify, where you can check out shirts, stickers, digital artwork, and more. Thank you.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that number one, so I think what you were saying about homologous structures is true. I think the issue is how it's explained. So, for example, from my perspective, homologous structures can be evidence of a common designer, not a common ancestor. And so that wouldn't change the data at all. It would just merely be in a different interpretation.
Well, it's a different, we could say a different interpretation, but what you need to do is back up your claim with something other than just looking at things, the structure of things, and being like, well, that's evidence of or that could be because of the designer. I wouldn't really say that it's evidence of the designer. You're just saying that it could be because of it. So then what I would need to see is the actual evidence of this designer.
So I really think you're basically saying the same thing, though. You're saying, look at the similarities between these two animals. Therefore, they must have a common ancestor. So your logic is exactly the same. The only difference is that instead of having a common ancestor, I'm invoking a common designer, right? So really, you wouldn't have, in both cases, you wouldn't have to necessarily present evidence of a common ancestor any more than I would have to prove which God is correct. It's merely just based on that alone. It really is. They look similar. Why? You say common ancestor, I'm saying common designer.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I can bolster my argument with genetics and the fossil record and comparative anatomy and embryology.
Sure.
And all those things.
Yeah, sure you could. And that would be great. But again, that wouldn't therefore make the first argument true, though, that you would still have to present, evidence of, a particular God in order for the reasoning to be valid. And in all these different areas that you would mention, I think there are also perfectly fine explanations as well.
Like what?
Well, I think that Peterson had really talked about, Hox genes as an example, right? Which certainly, just as he said, are, play the role in development of, essentially the body plan, right? They're like responsible for, specifying the position of body segments and, like during embryonic development. So all that's fine, that's true. But that's not the same, though, as presenting evolution for universal common descent, okay? Well, I can agree that animals can adapt and change, according to many things, right? Their diet, their environment, even mutations can play a role. And Hox genes are awesome, no problem with that. But that's not evidence of universal common descent, because these things can be perfectly like what they are, right? No one's got to disagree with them. The point is that it's not evidence; it doesn't follow. It's like a
no. I think it absolutely is evidence, because the only thing that genes can tell you about if you look at the genes of two different people, for example, all genes does is inform us about the degree of relatedness between two things. The fact that all life on this planet shares at least one gene is direct evidence of common descent. The idea that all life on this planet exists was proposed long before we knew anything about genetics, and then we actually figured out what controls for the characteristics that organisms have, and genetics is an enormous part of it. So if life wasn't related, then genetics would have told us otherwise, but it told us exactly that. Now, if you flip around and say, well, that's evidence of a designer, there is no evidence of the designer, because this was not a prediction consistent with a designer. It's just that people looked at the the evidence after the fact and said, yeah, well, I mean, a designer could have done that, but that's not evidence. That's just like a post hoc rationalization. But also, a
Dude,
designer
how
can
is
literally
that
do
post hoc?
anything, so it has no explanatory value.
Peterson, you are literally begging the question when
No, I'm
you
not.
say, yeah, you literally when you say that a homologous structure, Hox genes, the fact these are related, therefore evolution is true. You are literally begging the question. And then
No,
saying that
you
the same
totally
reasoning-
missed what I said. You missed the fact that at one point we had no idea how this works, but there was a prediction that all life is related through common descent, and then we figured out how do you actually test that, and then the tests confirmed our idea. That's not question begging, because it would be if in the current age there was, like, if we didn't have evolution until we figured all this stuff out, and then we started being like, well, let's interpret the evidence to try to make evolution work. That's not how it happened. That's exactly what the intelligent design argument is, though.
Okay, so again, I'm not disagreeing that evolution is real. No one's disagreeing with that. The question is, how do you explain it? All right, so you're begging the question in that you are combining your interpretation with the data. Okay, they are not one.
No, we looked at the data to see if it was consistent with the model, and it was.
Yeah, and that's the point. It's perfectly consistent as well to say that things have a common designer in what we see versus homologous.
But there never
structure,
was.
the fact that all animals contain genes.
But
It's
there was
same
never a
line of
proposed
reasoning.
mechanism for the common designer argument. The whole idea about life being specially created was that they couldn't. There was absolutely no built-in assumption of relatedness. Everything was created independently. What happened is, I think that the intelligent design thing is the question begging, because it made it. There's nothing about genetics that you can glean from intelligent design except after the fact.
Okay, so please stop cutting me off. All right.
Okay.
So number one, any type of genetics you want to start looking at. I really like studying humans, because there's actually there's a perfect example of how you 100% can derive a designer through studying human genetics. Okay. In fact, one of the leader of the Human Genome Project, okay, is a creationist and saw this as clear evidence of the information contained in the genome being evidence of a designer. Just because you don't like the explanation doesn't make it false. It's perfectly reasonable to conclude that things in your genes which contain information are the product of a mind. Now, which God is that? Which religion is true? That's a totally separate topic. And I think that's really where it's being jumped to. And the second thing I want to point out is that Peterson, these things are well understood. Okay, very well understood. The variation has limits. Just because you can demonstrate how animals can adapt to their environment is not therefore evidence of universal common descent. These are things
that
you
alone
can't
wouldn't
even
be.
observe in real time. You must extrapolate microevolutionary changes over long periods of time. They are not one and the same.
So, two things. One, Francis Collins, although he's a Christian, would agree 100% with me on the facts of evolution, because the facts of evolution don't prove or disprove that a God is responsible for, like, the universe existing and like life existing on our planet, right? So I don't really know what your point of bringing Francis Collins up was, because I thought our contention was, well, yeah. So anyways, let me just
You're
back
saying
up.
it's not
If you bring up
consistent with
Francis
a theist
Collins,
position.
he's
Is
going to agree
Francis
with me
Collins a
far more
theist?
than he agrees with you.
Is Francis Collins a theist?
Yeah? He's the
Yes.
Human
Okay.
Genome
So then
Project
the
guy.
leader of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, is a theist.
Yes,
So that
but
supports
the
my
point is he
position
thinks
that
evolution happened exactly the way I think it happened,
and I
not the way
told you I
you think it
agree with
happened.
that.
He doesn't
Peterson,
think
I
evolution has
agree.
limits and can't produce new
Yeah,
species.
absolutely he does.
No, he doesn't.
100%. Yes,
He
he
doesn't
does.
think that the Earth is only a few thousand years old or anything like that.
Yeah, no, that's not even the point. I said it's an agreement with theism. Okay, these are consistent with believing they were derived from a god. That's the point, Peterson. And the answer is yes. You said no, it's not consistent with that. I pointed out Francis Collins, and you just proved my point. Yes,
No,
he is a theist.
you're conflating two completely different arguments.
Okay, what am I conflating?
Francis Collins thinks that life on this planet is derived from the very first microbial life billions of years ago.
Okay.
And you don't think that. So Francis Collins actually doesn't really support your argument apart from that a god had something to do with it.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Again, my only point in bringing him up was that it's consistent with the idea of a designer. That was the only point. I'm not trying to say that he's a young earth creationist. My point is that Francis Collins is one of the geneticists who confirm that studying genes is consistent with deriving from a designer. Okay. He can also accept a common ancestor. I think I'm conflating the two. I'm just saying they are separate. So I agree with your position, just so you understand.
Okay. So
Okay,
like the
as a
point is
separate topic, then, to separately address, then, the point is that animals' ability to adapt, okay, is dependent upon the process, natural selection, being able to create new genetic information. This is what I'm saying we know is limited, okay, and is not able to produce the types of things that you're talking about. So I'll give you a hard example,
we don't know
okay?
that.
Yes, I think that there's much evidence to suggest so, and I'll give you a solid example, okay?
I
So we're talking about the differences, say, between animals that possess a nervous system and ones that don't. So sponges do not possess a nervous system, okay? Now, other animal types do.
that's
So the
yeah,
type of
that's
evolution
yeah.
you are talking about, okay, is one that can produce the type of genes that would then create a nervous system during reproduction. Okay, this is the type of evolution that cannot be observed in real time because all we observe is ones that animals that have it or animals that don't. There is no like transitionary between almost having a nervous system and then having it.
Yeah, but there
There
are
are no
organisms that
transitions.
have
You
more
either have one or
rudimentary
don't.
nervous systems than other organisms, which is perfectly consistent with the idea that nervous systems have not exactly evolved independently, but they evolved and then sort of diverged in their own unique ways.
I'm not trying to disagree that there are different kinds of nervous systems. I'm stating that there are animals that do not possess them. And so the type of evolution that would need to be true in order for universal common descent to be true is the kind that can create a nervous system in an organism that does not have one, is the point. And there are no examples of this. And really, all that's done is really, I would call, a faith claim, which is that you appeal to the past, something that cannot be observed, to a process that takes too long to observe. And again, the known limits of what shuffling genes, copying genes, it is not within the ability to. It's to me, it's not the best explanation. The best explanation would be that some were created with.
Appealing.
So my friend Silico in the comment section, she quoted me a type of article. I haven't read it personally yet, but so the article basically states simple sponges provide clues to the origin of the nervous system. So yeah, that may yield some results. I can't pull it up. I can't.
Yeah. So, anyways, I want to just real quick, sorry, my phone glitched out there for a second. But when you say, like, we have to assume a lot and the past isn't directly observable and so on and so forth, and then you say, I think a more salient explanation is creation. I mean, that's a horrible explanation because it can't actually explain anything, because it claims to be able to explain literally anything, which ironically makes it worthless as an explanation, because if it could do anything, then it explains nothing in particular. But also, I mean, just appealing to a miracle is just so, there's no critical thinking there. It's just there.
Yeah, so I understand your argument, and actually, it's not a bad argument, but the solution to it is realizing that we actually have examples of creation in order in which to compare.
Like what?
So what?
Like what? Name one thing that's
yeah,
created. And I don't mean like man-made, because that's
well,
obvious,
listen,
but
well, here, let me finish, and I will give you examples. Okay, so the point is that you would be correct in saying that, dude, just invoking God could be the explanation of everything, and in that sense, it's practically an explanation of nothing, because it could just be anything. So I want you to understand, I know your argument, I know what you're saying. Now, the reason why this is false is because we can, in fact, compare it to things we know are designed. So now to address what you're saying, well, things that humans create don't count. So to me, that is so biased to then therefore take things that we know were designed by humans and say these cannot be compared to nature. To me, that's a huge bias.
Because with nature, the jury is still out. Is nature created, or does nature simply exist? You can't say, well, here's an example of something that we already know. Like the answer is already known, and then compare that to the thing that we haven't figured out yet. So I need to, like, what evidence of something created do you have where the jury is still out?
So, well, I mean, I can answer that. I would honestly love to actually press you on that. I mean, it's sort of tough for me because I'm just sort of honest. I would love to answer your question, but I don't think that you've really given any good reason to think that you can't compare what humans create to nature. Because what other, like,
I mean, you could compare it, I guess, but
explain it, except I'm going to exclude everything we know is created. Like, it's like reverse begging the problem. It's like,
it's not, though.
I'm going to talk about things that humans have created, right? Of course. That's the point.
The reason that's a terrible comparison to make is because the things that we know that humans have designed, cars, watches, whatever, we don't see recursively reproducing themselves, right? If a house had a house baby that looks slightly different, completely apart to whatever we did, then sure, it would be a logical question to ask if the modern day houses around us were a product of this natural variation in recursively self-reproducing houses. If a Rolex had a Rolex baby that looked slightly different, that would be a completely logical reason to start wondering whether or not the Rolexes around us were a byproduct of these natural processes occurring. We don't see that happening. Every time an automobile is made, it is the direct hand of a human. But that doesn't apply to nature. The birds around us are a byproduct of natural variation and self-reproduction.
Okay, so this is a straw man argument. You're committing a fallacy, because the only presupposition I need to be true is it needs to be designed. What you're doing is you're overcomplicating it and saying that, one, it needs to be alive, and two, it needs to be able to reproduce. And that's why you gave example of a house, because a house is not alive and it cannot reproduce. This is a straw man argument, because the only thing I need to demonstrate is that it is in fact designed. That's it. It doesn't have to be alive. It does not need to be able to reproduce. So, straw man argument. All right, now to address,
It's not a straw man argument
yes, it
though,
is.
because
Now,
I'm not. I'm not.
Let me finish. Straw man argument.
Because there is no
Next
case
point,
to make.
Yeah, you lost.
Just because
All right,
something is
let me
complex
continue.
around
Okay.
us currently.
Yeah, you're wrong. Clearly wrong. Okay.
not
Yeah,
design.
listen, it's very, very simple. If it is designed, then I'm allowed to compare it. It does not have to be alive. It does not have to be able to reproduce. This is what you are trying to make.
If it is
and
designed,
it's a straw
but you
man.
have yet to establish that it is.
Okay, so can I please finish? All right, thanks.
Sure. Give your example. Go ahead.
Listen, this right here is a GIF or a GIF, depending on how you want to talk about it.
It's
Okay.
GIF.
It's a GIF. Okay, so this right here was imprinted using CRISPR in the genome of bacteria. This is the original, and then it was reconstructed from bacteria. Now, this was done by geneticists at Harvard, okay? This is Harvard researchers embedded images in the genomes of bacteria to test the limits of DNA storage. Okay, so why is this important? The reason why it's important is because this is something comparable. I'm sorry, I'm wearing a tank top. All right. I just wanted
Oh
to-
God, it's horrible.
I just wanted to show you my face. Okay, I'm perfect.
Absolutely offended.
So listen, the point is that this contains information. We know that because it can be manipulated. And so they're actually uploading GIFs into the genome of bacteria. And this is exactly like DNA. DNA is coded information. All right. Now listen, this does not mean that there has to be a designer. I could be wrong. The only point is that it's reasonable to conclude that there is a designer behind this process. And then even further, to connect that to my original point, is that when we're talking about the limits in what animals can do in reproduction through natural selection, this is a good example of how, again, the knowledge, the information, we know it. It can be manipulated. It's well understood. And so there's no reason, really, you're kind of in the same way invoking something took place in the past. And even though we can't observe it taking place today, I believe those limits can be overcome, right? That's what you believe. Certainly it's possible. I just don't think it's the best explanation.
So, the whole thing with we encoded the information on the genome. We can encode. You're on a phone right now. We can encode information on silica and carbon atoms.
Yep.
So there's nothing special about the fact that we can do it with DNA, because we can do it with literally the simplest forms of matter. And DNA is made of matter.
It doesn't matter as long as it contains information. If we agree on that premise,
Yeah, but
then my
an
argument
atom
is
contains
incoherent.
information.
Yeah, exactly. And so if we can agree
Right.
on
So again,
that, then
the creation thing, or the designer thing, literally we can just point to anything in the universe, even just simple atoms, and be like, yeah, and they're designed too. This is what I was talking about earlier, where because it can literally explain anything, it explains nothing in particular.
Yeah, and listen, what I'm trying to tell you is that the reason why, the only reason why that is false, is because we can, in fact, compare it to things we know are created. And again, they don't need to be alive. They don't need to be able to reproduce. As long as we know it's designed, then we have a basis in which to compare something else we believe could be designed. And that's where I think evolution actually begins to fail. Because while it's certainly a fact, all the different things that we've talked about in Hox genes and how animals can adapt, and I mean, there are even cases where they produce new metabolic functions. There's no problem with that. The question is that evidence of universal common descent, and I think the answer is no.
Yes.
And there are many evolutionists who agree with me on this, by the way. This is not like some just a theist.
No, I don't think that's true. Like you brought up Francis Collins earlier. Francis Collins agrees 100% with Simon and I about the facts of evolution. Evolution doesn't say whether or not God exists. Now, Francis Collins also believes in that, but no, I don't think there are any evolutionary. There's probably some evolutionary biologist who actually thinks life was specially created, but that I perhaps, I'm not 100% sure, but anyways.
Yeah, I mean, so have you seen the actually Joe Rogan recently interviewed a scientist on intelligent design, and he actually
Stephen Meyer's not a scientist.
yeah, he is.
No, he has a PhD in the philosophy of science.
Okay, so you can have a degree in the philosophy of science, but you're saying therefore that they don't actually do any.
He doesn't do any scientific research.
Are you joking right now? Is
No.
that a joke? Yes, people in the philosophy of science absolutely study science. That's like what
They study they study science, but they don't do any actual scientific research.
Yeah, oh, well, hey, I hope you're consistent with that in the sense of astrophysicists then. Like a theoretical astrophysicist, they also don't perform any scientific experiments. You agree with that?
So some of them deal in mathematics, but they publish scientific papers
Oh my
that
God.
contribute to our understanding of astronomy.
And-
That's very different than somebody that just like writes about science.
Stephen Meyer hasn't published any papers? Is that what you're
Okay,
saying?
Not
to
scientific
say something
papers,
before
no.
we completely move on here. This, Mike, you bring up this idea of like the complexity of the human genome, and that's an argument that humans are designed because of their complexity, and you use like genetic features or whatnot to make the claim that because in the 21st century, what we see around us genomically is all super intricate and thus designed. But there's not a single thing that you can point to that thus then concludes design. The size of the human genome, we can see either growing bigger or getting smaller through natural mechanisms, gene duplication, polyploidy. All of these things increase the size of the genome. You have pseudogenes, ERVs, transposons, also doing these things, increasing the apparent complexity of the genome. You have a whole bunch of mechanisms by which actual genes, like functional genes, duplicate in the genome. You have things called paralogous genes, meaning ancestor genes duplicate and then sub-functionalize, producing new genes. We look around the natural world, we sequence things, and we see the mechanism by which genomes are so complex. Naturally, unless you're going to say that every gene duplication we observe today is the direct hand of an intelligent designer pulling the strings right before our eyes and we just can't notice, then okay, maybe, I guess you're internally consistent. But if nature is just happening around us and that is what it does, then it absolutely can account for the complexity that we see in the human genome, which is why I say that your comparison to inanimate objects that don't self-reproduce in recursively varying ways is fallacious, because nature around us is constantly varying, constantly increasing or decreasing in complexity, unlike these one-off inventions that humans definitely made.
Okay, I think I hear what you're saying. Yeah. So listen, if I were to explain this a little differently, all right. So just to stick with DNA. So like if you're going to take, a sequence of 12 letters in the English language that conveys a meaning. Okay, there are 100 trillion other possible ways of arranging those same characters that don't. So the point is that regardless of whether, we're looking at an example created by humans which can reproduce, is that it still turns out to be the same thing in the DNA protein case. All right, whether we're talking about a human language or we're talking about DNA, this is the argument about information. And so even if you're going to take like a modest protein of just 150 amino acids or something, for every sequence that produces a functional protein, right, that would produce something in an animal that is beneficial, there's like 10 to the 77th power other possibilities that don't. And so the point is that there's a huge search space that has to be searched by the random mutational mechanism to try and find a functional sequence in the vast array of possibilities. So I think really.
But how many functional versions are there? We don't know. It could be limitless. So it's
again,
you could argue that it's inevitable that some
to.
sort of function will be had.
Listen, it doesn't matter, okay, because you have a time scale. We still have ones that we do know. This combination produces this in an animal. So even assuming 4 billion years of history of life on planet Earth, there's not even enough replication events, enough copying events to search the space of possible proteins effectively.
That's not so. No, this.
Yeah,
that's
also
what
ignore
this
that.
argument is predicated on, the idea that we have a trillion versions that don't work and one that does. What are the odds of getting the one that works correct? But that's a deeply flawed way of looking at it, because who says that this one way is the only way?
Well, wait a second, though. Wait a second, though. Do you believe this system is guided by a designer, or do you think it's guided by a chance mutational process?
The second one?
Exactly. That's the point. Okay, that's exactly
No, that wasn't.
the point.
No, that wasn't the point. The point was that the odds are too small.
No,
You're trying to
listen.
force
If
this
if
fascination.
you are not going to invoke any type of it, which I would even agree with, by the way, that if you're not going to invoke some type of a guided process, the bottom line is that based on mathematics of probability, the neo-Darwinian mechanism is just not a plausible mechanism for generating new functional biological information. It's just not. You must, in the past, assume that the limits we observe today were surpassed. And I gave you a solid example of an animal that does not possess a nervous system. Within their genome, they do not possess the ability to just produce an animal that does have a nervous system. But you believe that that's what happened. That sometime in the past, no matter how many small micro changes you need to invoke, that these animals did in fact start.
I can't fly, but that doesn't mean, and I don't think humans will ever evolve the ability to fly. But that doesn't mean that something could not have evolved the ability to fly.
So I'm probably not doing a good job describing it fully. So I agree with that. I'm not saying it's not possible. It is possible. Like, there are functional proteins that could, in fact, be found by chance. You shuffle the genes, give it enough time, and eventually you'll get it. Like, I understand the reasoning. I'm saying it's not the best explanation. And in the interview that Joe Rogan did with Stephen C. Meyer, which I think you sort of discredited him unjustified.
I just said that he's not a scientist, and he doesn't write scientific papers.
But whatever, I'm not actually even talking about him to talk about one of his published papers. What I'm saying is that in that interview, he actually gave a whole list of different institutions. One of them, I believe, was the British Royal Society of Science, that they recently held a conference last year where they themselves pointed out that the neo-Darwinian mechanism is not the best explanation for trying to explain the new functioning biological information we see. It's just not good enough. You're welcome to believe it if you want, but I think you invoke a strong measure of faith.
No, Meyer also really misquoted those people. If you go to YouTube and you look up stated clearly, it's either stated clearly or stated casually, I don't remember. But he did a breakdown of that with somebody that was actually at that conference, and they talked about how Meyer's...
What's it called? Stated clearly?
I'm pretty sure it's stated clearly.
I
He
got
did
no
a
problem
video
with
on it.
that.
He's got a really good YouTube channel.
Response to Stephen C. Meyer. I'll look it up.
I mean,
No problem at all.
Again, we're just kind of pointing to proteins, and Mike, you're just trying to give the impression. Be super fascinated when I think what you're leaning on is, to be respectful, kind of a shallow understanding, because that you're giving this impression that there is absolutely only one amino acid sequence by which a functional protein can work. And
No.
that's definitely not true, because
That's not what I said. You're not listening.
we can see slightly mutated proteins still doing their job. There is a degree, there is a plasticity to how much a protein can be broken and still functional. The
Yeah, no, I
efficiency
agree
and
with you.
fidelity
That's
of
not what I said.
enzymes can be altered by slight variations. I mean, I did that work. So this
I agree
idea
with you,
that there
Simon.
is only one slight variation of a protein that might be functional, but also this idea that proteins can do multiple jobs within the cell. We don't need a fresh, new, novel amino acid sequence for absolutely every job within a cell to be accomplished.
That's
There are
true.
many, many, many cases of proteins doing several jobs. So that also
Yep.
decreases the variability, this hunt for functional proteins, when we know that life repurposes proteins all the time. These rudimentary nervous systems you're talking about, or that have been mentioned in this discussion before, sensory cells are an aspect of every complex nervous system thereafter, right? We see the implementation and refunctioning of proteins and structures and anatomy all the time. Evolution doesn't work just by inventing out of thin air every solution.
I totally agree. I'm not in disagreement with you. Listen, so Simon, you're right. You're definitely right. I'm not disagreeing with that. To clarify, my argument was not that there's only one or that there's only a few. My point was that for every sequence that does produce a functional protein, there is 10 to the 77th power other possibilities that don't. And the way that this can be measured using mathematics is comparing it to, say, English. If you take 12 letters in the English language, for every combination of those letters that does convey a meaning, or in this case, a functional protein, there is 100 trillion other possible ways of arranging the same letters that doesn't. So I'm not in disagreement with what you said. My point is that there's vastly more that don't work than ones that do. And so the point is that it becomes extremely unlikely that this would be the explanation given the vast, huge search space that the random mutational mechanism needs to search. That was my point. Now, I would add that the one thing I would say differently is that when we're talking about that reasoning, again, that wasn't my reasoning, but let's say it was. I mean, Simon, that's how I feel a lot of evolutionists treat the situation. They treat it as though different representatives, but same concept. So they'll say that the only way that we could get the type of diversity we see amongst all living things is through the natural selection, okay? And my point is that no, you could also have an alternative explanation, which could be a designer that set it into motion and then the process began. So I also don't invoke that God is like working through every reproduction and, actively guiding these changes or something. No, he built a system that replicates and adapts, which is very smart, by the way, because animals get in different climates. And they are able to, in fact, change in many ways. I'm just saying it's limited. The limits are known through thousands of years of selective breeding or divergent evolution or microevolution, whatever you want to call it. There are limits to genetic variations. That's why you even need to invoke mutations. Mutations are not, well, it does sort of depend. There's different kinds of mutations, but generally speaking, mutations are used in order to fill the gaps in between these alleged jumps in history. And it doesn't matter whether it happened quickly or it happened over a long period. You will choose whichever one you need to in order to get rid of the idea that it could have been intentionally created. This is something that actually I talked about with Paleo last time when I was on with Mike. Okay, it's like it's called give me a second. It's called punctuated equilibrium, right? Which proposes that some of these changes could have happened quickly. So again, I think on the evolutionist side, I actually think you do kind of have that reasoning sometimes, where you assume this must be the only way, when in fact I think there's certainly other possibilities, and in the least, I think it's just a better explanation.
Okay, real quick. I'm actually pretty hungover, so I need to leave soon. But I just want to address the thing you were talking about with like the amino acids and all that. If I flip a coin 100 times and I write down the particular sequence of heads, tails that happens, what are the odds that that exact sequence gets repeated?
I'm not sure. I would know that if we're just talking about flipping a coin, it's 1 and 2, isn't it?
Yeah, so you'd have to multiply the odds. Basically, you can figure it out by taking 2 to the 99th power. Those are the odds, and it's a number with 30 digits, right? Therefore, the coin flip must have been miraculous, because the only way to get the sequence I got, or because those are the odds of the odds of getting what I got are only 1 in a number with 30 digits in it.
Yeah.
So that doesn't make any sense as an argument, right?
so-
It wasn't a miraculous coin flip.
but
The thing with the
Peterson-
amino acid sequences is this, it's the same argument, because it assumes that this is the only possible way that that protein can be arranged to have any kind of function, which we know isn't true. But it also assumes that the life we have today and the molecules within organisms that we have today are the only kinds of molecules that can work. And there's no reason to assume that's true either. And the fact that life varies proves that that's not true also.
So I hear you, Peterson. I thought I clarified that it doesn't have to be the only way. Certainly, it's possible. I'm not disagreeing with that. I told you, even if the chances are extremely low, if you invoke more time, of course, you could eventually get it. I'm not denying that. It doesn't have to be, okay? So I agree with that. My only point is that based on the data itself, I think the best explanation would in fact be that it was intentionally done. In the same way that if you walked into a room and there were 1,000,000 toothpicks scattered over the ground and it said, "Hey, I put this together. My name is Joe," or it was a line of Shakespeare, or it was a mathematical equation. Like, what are the chances the toothpicks fell and just randomly formed this? Like, no, of course, maybe it could. It's possible. It's just not the best explanation. That's my point.
I think that's a category error, because you're comparing
In one way,
you're comparing a process that has no internal drive to it to one that does.
That is correct. Yeah, they're not equivalent. It's not fully equivalent.
Yeah.
I'm only merely trying to profess like coded information, and we look at it. What are the chances that it formed naturally? And so you are correct. I'm just saying I still think it would be a better explanation to evoke a design.
I would love to stay and argue, but I've been here for an hour and I need to go drink water.